The Center for Educational Media and the College of Education at Middle Tennessee State University are proud to offer professional development to K-12 educators in Tennessee through our online video library. These videos are aligned with standards set by the Tennessee Department of Education. For more professional development videos, check out our website at cem.mtsu.edu.
My name is Lisa Swart, and I teach in the history department at MTSU. So when we look at the Egyptian civilization through the lens of the 21st century, and from a distance of more than 4,000 years, we can be tempted to look at ancient Egyptian society as a stable system with preset hierarchical structure and predefined mode of rule and government lacking any substantial development in terms of status, structure, and competence. One popular history written around 2010, the author claims a complex, sophisticated high culture arose in Egypt virtually without warning. Almost overnight, cities appeared where only tiny villages had existed. A civil service took the place of rule by village notables. A semi-divine king ascended the throne of Egypt, supplanting tribal chiefs. The author goes on to state, the ancient Egyptians witnessed no breaches, profound changes, and dark ages. The Egyptians themselves projected the past in chronological lists as an ordered, peaceful succession of reigns of previous kings, each passing the throne to his successor in a clear, direct, linear sequence. Notations in the lists mention the good kings and those who had unsavory reputations as models for the future. What is not mentioned is the historical reality of political wrangling and opportunism that created dynastic change. For example, the intestine warfare between dynasties 11 and 12 that culminated in a civil war between the ruling families in Thebes and Hierakonpolis, and brings in the first intermediate period, which represents the first major disruptions, breach, and dark age. In modern times, Egyptologists have used these lists to create a convenient grouping of three solid Egyptian historical periods. And we have the Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, and New Kingdom, and they're broken down into the various dynasties from 1 through 31. So these groupings make life so much easier for teaching history. And so creating and reinforcing that idea of a continuous linear progression of Egyptian civilization. Current research has shown that these historical periods to be more fluid than originally thought. They're not static and unchanging as portrayed in early and popular histories. The history of ancient Egypt, as with other ancient civilizations, is complex, complicated, and convoluted, and should be seen as constantly evolving and adapting to current circumstances. This is key to the Egyptian survival as a civilization over the millennia. As you will see, the Egyptians borrowed freely from other cultures when it suited their purposes, experimented with new concepts, and veiled them in archaized form. Nor were they immune to breaches, profound changes, or dark ages. Today, I would like to take us on a journey to the origins of the ancient Egyptian civilization, to the Old Kingdom, and view a brief snapshot of this civilization through the lens of the institution of kingship and the monumentalization of burial structures. So we get to talk about the pyramids. So here, our breakdown of Egyptian civilization. The messy, murky areas have been designated as our intermediate periods. So, and a fuzzy term. Egyptian civilization is quite remarkable. when one thinks about it. It developed in one of the largest arid desert areas in the world, larger than the whole of Europe. Civilization is only possible because of the Nile River, carrying waters from the Lake Victoria almost 3,000 miles to the Mediterranean Sea. Fossil evidence from the Nile River valley shows habitation of hominids going back at least 500,000 years ago, and continuous habitation of the Nile River valley. Agriculture is made possible because of the salt deposits of the annual flooding of the Nile River when snow melted in the Ethiopian highlands. And the symbolism of the Nile inundation is an integral part of ancient Egyptian culture. And we see it echoed over and over again in their religion. Egypt is considered one of the earliest nation states, denoting a political and national entity. Its origins are noteworthy because many of the prevailing factors involved in state formation found in other contemporary civilizations, such as Mesopotamia, are absent. The first being competition for natural resources. The early Egyptian population was fairly small, numbering in the low millions at the height of the civilization. And the natural resources of the Nile River were fairly abundant. By the Roman period, Egypt was known as the grain basket of the ancient world. So that rules out competition for resources. Military incursions by foreign actors can also be ruled out. So going back, if you look at the geography of Egypt, you're surrounded pretty much on all sides by the desert and then by the Mediterranean Sea. So incursions by these foreign rulers and threats only appear later on in Egyptian history. So in terms of state formation, the Egyptians are fairly insulated. However, they are also embarking on long-distance trade with other civilizations. Archaeological evidence points to settled agriculture as a catalyst. Small communities or settlements of farmers, most likely egalitarian, developed into agricultural towns, we believe. The dead were buried in small pits in a fetal position with few possessions. This indicates a belief in some type of afterlife, and there is care in the burial of the dead. Excuse me. According to Barry Kemp's game theory of civilization, these towns coalesced, become larger, and develop into fortified towns, and become cities with fewer leaders who monopolized larger assets and monopolies and commodities. This heralds the pre-dynastic period around 4000 BCE. Eventually, these become proto-states, what he has developed, his proto-state theory. Our main towns we're looking at are Nagada, Hierakonpolis, and Abydos. Burials in cemetery T in Nagada demonstrate high levels of social stratification, and in terms of the size and contents of graves. Cemetery T graves are large, and 3 were lined with brick. So the graves have been created with care and thought into the preservation of the body. One undertomb T5 contained carved stone vessels and jewelry made from exotic imported materials. Tomb 11 in the Wadi Abu al-Safian contained the remains of a wooden bed carved with bull's feet, beads and amulets made from gold, silver, carnelian, turquoise, and lapis lazuli. So we're looking at these graves becoming much wealthier and more lavish as time is going on, indicating higher levels of increased levels of wealth in these societies. Another pre-dynastic cemetery, HK43, contains well-preserved burials and provide significant information on mortuary practices of this time. 2 people died violent deaths. One had a slit throat and another had a blow to the head. They have consequently found other bodies, at least 21 skeletons that show violent death. We're still trying to figure out what may have occurred during this time period. One woman's natural hair had been dyed to hide the gray and had been augmented with curled hair extensions. Over 5,000 years, and we're still trying to get rid of gray hair. They've also found a toupee where a follicularly challenged man was buried. So the desire to improve upon one's appearance has a very long history. Several of these burials contain evidence of intentional preservation of the body. Bones are wrapped in with tree bark and linen padding. I'm not quite sure if the tree bark may have had preservative qualities and stayed off decomposition. There are many substances, natural substances, that tend to do that. But linen padding is utilized, and in some instances, the hands and the arms are wrapped. So we're moving forward into the desire to preserve the body as completely as possible. We also see some evidence of hieroglyphic writing at this time, and we have a few signs being written on a clay coffin from this period. And based on iconographic evidence, we can also see that it's possible that the late pre-dynastic period, we have the institution of kingship becoming entrenched in Egyptian civilization amongst these various proto-states, albeit it's a constantly developing concept. In its fully evolved form, Egyptian kingship was defined as the king having an exclusive relationship with the gods. He controlled religious benefits and owned all of Egypt. He owned the resources, water, land, people, and products. He was semi-divine, the product of a union between a mortal man and a deity. Later, he was responsible for ensuring order, killing and trampling the enemies of the state. And this is a classic pose that we see echoed time and time again well into ancient Egyptian civilization. All kings were depicted in the classic smiting pose.
Is this the normal palette, or is that something?
We're getting there. The king was the messenger, and he was the mediator between the gods and the people. So the king was important to the Egyptian state. Without the king, the Egyptian state would not exist, and the world would descend into chaos. So the unification of Egypt into one large territorial state, from the delta to the first cataract, the first series of rapids along the Nile River as we're moving south, occurs during this later dynastic period. The processes by which this occurs are not really well understood, but based on artifacts from this time period, it is believed that warfare may have played a significant role in unification. And we see decorated items from the later pre-dynastic and Dynasty 0 depicting warfare and its aftermath. This is known as the battlefield palette. The palettes were ceremonial makeup palettes, but they were used as a projection of the king's power and authority in terms of the decoration. What we see here is the king as a massive lion. He's tearing up and devouring his enemies who are lying prostrate on the battlefield before him. And so from this period, we often see the king depicted as a wild animal. Here, the king has superhuman strength that has been given to him by the gods, and he's harnessing that strength. The lion analogy is believed to be African in origin, and we see several aspects of African culture. For example, the mace, the ceremonial mace that the king carried around, and they also have a flail. It was used it originated as a fly swatter, but it became the symbol of kingship. So here we see cultural borrowings. So another carving from Nubia, so we're moving a little further south, which was considered a threat to these early proto-kings. We see the king depicted as a scorpion. So here we might see a depiction of the king scorpion here, attacking his enemies, within his pincers. This could depict a raid potentially on the people of Nubia, because they were throughout Egyptian history seen as a threat. And then finally we get to the Narmer palette. It's about 100 years older than the battlefield palette. And what is interesting is that you still see these depictions. You have the animal, and then you have the king as a human being. So we see this transition of the king to a human figure, no longer the animal. Narmer palette represents this transition between those types of representation. What is fantastic here is a really clear borrowing on this side, on the left, of iconography from ancient Mesopotamia. The two cultures had extensive dealings with each other, and the Egyptian kings appropriated the imagery that they felt suited them in terms of kingship. And so we see these, what we call serpopods, these leopards with the necks of serpents intertwined. And that is a classic Near Eastern image. And here we have the king at the bottom here, goring the enemy. He's in the form of a bull. Later in it, we often see the king referring to himself as a bull, representing the virility and strength of bulls. And then we also see some hieroglyphs in here. And if you'll believe me, between the two bulls' horns, at the top on the left there is a catfish representing the letters Na and a chisel Mer. So that's where we get the name Narmer, and so we know who it is. So we're seeing evidence of hieroglyphs. So the jury's still out on whether the palette of Narmer represents an actual event. Some people think it does. Some people say it's a metaphor. And the Egyptian kings were known to use older imagery and claim it as their own. So it's a common practice. So we're not quite sure what this really does depict. We also see similar depictions of the kings smiting foes on small ivory labels that were used to identify products in tombs. So this is a common theme that occurs. So going back to Narmer, this palette represents the almost fully fledged development of royal iconography, and we'll see this scene being created often, and right up until the end of Egyptian civilization, the fallen enemies, the power of the king over foreign peoples. Yes?
Just a quick question. I made a big deal to my students, and I hope I didn't do it incorrectly, about the helmets they're wearing, the crown of the white king over that of the red king, and then perhaps the unified crown on the other side. But you said the battlefield palette was 100 years later, but only seemed to have the red. Which wouldn't that contradict that whole like unification of upper and lower, white and red?
So the battlefield was 100 years earlier.
Earlier, thank you.
Yes.
I thought you said later.
But they do use these. The merger between the North and the South is the common theme. So what actually what is believed is that the crowns were actually part of the imagery of Upper Egypt, but they came to represent Lower and Upper. Right. and it's not necessarily, the unification is not necessarily this strict division between North and South. It was probably much more fragmented and a lot more complicated, but the kings claimed to have unified North and South. And it may have, and they did divide Egypt into these administrative districts of North and South. So this is just legitimizing further their rule over these administrative districts. So they created this kind of murky view of their history. And that is the problem with ancient Egypt, is that we have these artifacts that may represent actual things, and then we have a time where we don't find very much, and then we have the next. We have a later time, and we have a lot of artifacts from that time. So there's a tendency just to kind of move from one to the next, and kind of skip that kind of murky and gray area. So we still have to fill in a lot of the blanks, and with new technologies, we are constantly rewriting the history of Egypt, which is exciting because it's a constantly evolving field. So back to this one. I've mentioned writing. Writing in itself appeared first in Sumer. So I think Egyptologists had always been saying writing appeared first in Egypt, and there was kind of this competition between them and people studying Mesopotamia. But it's accepted now generally that it comes first. And the concept of writing is transferred through trade to ancient Egypt. The two systems have really nothing in common. So it could potentially have been some person who was bright enough to realize that they saw Sumerian script, and they looked at the script and said, oh, maybe we could do something similar. So it sparked a literary revolution, the creation of an alphabet. So I gave you a handout with the classic Egyptian alphabet and ways on the accepted pronunciations of the Egyptian words. We have no idea how they are pronounced, and different countries have different spelling and pronunciation conventions. So it's still up there. If you go on YouTube, you can actually hear someone telling the stories in ancient Egyptians as to how they believed it occurred. But we get writing evolves into a highly complicated script, hieroglyphs composed of over 500 symbols. And the hieroglyphs themselves were considered words of the gods. They were sacred. Very early on, we see that hieroglyphs were not the main form of text used in ancient Egypt. They were, it was used for sacred writing, for formal writing of the state, and burials. The Egyptians themselves used hieratic. It's a cursive, quick form of writing for administrative tasks. Later, that's used also in funerary burials, because it conveys much more information, much quicker, and as Egyptian funerary texts become more available to more people, you need to produce this much quicker.
Is that different than docetic? Hieratic?
Hieratic, then we have demotic, which is kind of bridges the gap between Egyptian and Greek. And so the writing evolves over time. Another thing that we see is a borrowing from Mesopotamian culture and was used for quite a while is architecture, the palace architecture. It's a series of receding and buttresses, niches and buttresses. We call this palace facade architecture, and it was used throughout the Old Kingdom in Egypt. The kings adopted this as a visual display of their power, and it remained for quite a while. We see it in Old Kingdom tombs being emulated, and also in the sarcophagi from this time period. So they weren't shy about borrowing, but they made it their own. And this becomes the hallmark of the Egyptian monarchy of this time. Right? So here are more tags designating where products that were placed in tombs, they designates their origins. So we see that in these tombs we have hundreds of jars of wine, and each of those were labeled from their point of origin. So we know where these provisions came from. So it's a pretty handy tool to have these things. The Egyptians were very systematic and very logical, clear thinking. So what we see, the unification theme is prevalent in ancient Egypt. Each ruler claimed to be the king of Upper and Lower Egypt, and they demonstrated through motifs like this. So we'll see it in various forms throughout Egyptian history, and it's the standard feature. So the Upper Egypt is southern Egypt. Kind of how we look at the world is reversed. The Egyptians saw things in the reverse. The Nile floods came from the south. So for them, this was the upper part of Egypt. And the river flowed towards the north, and that's lower Egypt, the delta area. This is a relief from the temple of Ramses II. So we're looking at the 19th dynasty here. We have the two figures representing the north and the south. They are standing in between a carved central figure. This depicts the spine. It's highly stylized, and it forms with the symbolism for lungs, which would be on the side. So it's like, it can be written as a hieroglyphic sign. And they're tying a knot, a reef knot, and that represents the symbol of the unification. The one side will hold reeds representing northern Egypt. The other side holds, the rope is made of papyrus representing Upper Egypt, the southern part. And this symbolism is used continuously and adapted in different forms. So they kept a lot of things, but evolved them further. Here, okay. So just to briefly mention, the cartouche, that round circle enclosing the name of the king, represents eternity, and that became the standard format for the names of kings. So going into a museum, if you see something like this, you know immediately that that is a king. And ancient and earlier excavators got very excited when they saw anything like that, because that indicated that potential great artifacts that could be lying there. So by Dynasty 0, the consolidation of Egypt is complete. And the first royal burials appear in Abydos. And we have hundreds of ivory tags that are found designating all these goods and various foodstuffs and wine. We believe that some of this wine actually might be imported. So long-distance trade continues to be an important feature. The royal cemeteries of the First Dynasty are best exemplify the evolving concept of Egyptian kingship. We see new demonstrations of power, and they're pretty potent demonstrations, insinuating their control over the population of Egypt. So the cemeteries named al-Kab, and they were lavishly equipped with grave goods, and they were fairly big. And the grave goods become the norm at this point, but what is different, what we start seeing now, is this lavish show of conspicuous consumption. We have the subsidiary burials of servants, members of the court, around the king's burial chamber. And so that's unique. We hadn't seen that previously. The average age of these servants is 25. They had been sacrificed at the time of the king's death, and they were there to serve him in the afterlife. Jer's tomb, the King Jer, his tomb contains the most, with 338 burials. So, yeah, this is Egyptology's dirty little secret. It's something early Egyptologists couldn't really conceive. It didn't fit into their views of what ancient Egypt was. They had this preconceived notion that the Egyptians were this kind of higher culture, and followed along a fairly immoral path. They kind of put Egyptians on this pedestal, and then when they find these burials, that we start seeing explanations of, oh, these people may have committed suicide out of loyalty to the king. This might be a stretch. Closer investigation has revealed that these people died by strangulation. So the Egyptians were just as merciless as other civilizations. These funerary, as you can see here, these burials do contain provisions for the afterlife, and in many of them, the names of the individuals are mentioned. Also included is the burials of dogs and lions. So, and they're in the same areas. So this tells you how humans, these servants, were seen by the king. So it culminates. We see the height of human sacrifice in Jer's time, and it slowly declines by the end, and disappears by the end of the First Dynasty. And some people assume that maybe it was an economic consideration, because murdering your entire entourage, you depleting a whole level of human talent, and so that's not effective. It also may not have been very popular with the elite that served the king, and so there might have been pressure. So I'm heading towards maybe potentially pressure on the kings themselves. So, but and something we don't really think of when we think of ancient Egyptians. We also see other evidence for human sacrifice, and you might be a little challenged with this one, but I promise you, there is a guy kneeling and he's being stabbed in the chest. So these depictions are not uncommon. And it also dates to this time. Egyptian funerary texts, when they depict the underworld and afterlife, there are some pretty gory images. So maybe harking back to this time period where the gods are murdering their foes, the slaying of the serpent Apophis. So there is some violence. There's quite a lot of violence. So yeah. Dynasty 1 itself, I think, was the coolest because apart from human sacrifice, which is pretty bad, the kings of that dynasty also invented taxation. So double whammy there. The Egyptian state pioneered an impressive administration that took record keeping to an art form. A complex bureaucratic system arose of regional and local officials that were charged with assessing taxes. The state of Egypt was divided into bureaucratic districts, and these people would go out and they would measure the land allotments, and they would then measure the level of the Nile River, and they did a census of the population, and then they would assess the taxes based on their calculations, and they did this on a regular basis. The people of Egypt, majority of them owned no land. They rented the land from the king, who owned everything. There was some private land. You had your temples, and they did not pay taxes. There were private individuals who were given land, but they had to pay taxes to the king as well. So
you referred to rent. Is the taxes or rent or both?
So the rent being taxes. Okay. So kind of maybe a more medieval type of concept. But the Egyptians, they were giving their agricultural products to the king in return for being able to live on this land. And so what we see is that this agricultural surplus is taken and it's stored in royal granaries and storerooms. Some of this is given to the mortuary cults and temples, and it's donated in the name of the king, and it shows how great the king is and is able to sustain these temples. These temples often became, through private donations and donations by the king, became large and powerful, and they became entire economies into themselves. And and also the king had a mortuary temple associated with his burial, and you kept a temple personnel there that continued to serve you in your afterlife. So you wanted to ensure that those donations kept coming in. So this takes us to the next level, the third dynasty. This is where the Old Kingdom really begins. It encompasses a period of roughly 500 years, and it goes to the 6th dynasty. Here we see a new order of royal power, the ability to command vast resources, both human and material, and to construct monumental architecture. And this architecture is constructed entirely of stone, which represents a whole other level of engineering. This is the Pyramid Age to us. To the Egyptians, this was their golden age, an age to which they always hearkened back. And when we talk about archaizing, they look back to the ancient to this Pyramid Age, and they attempt to emulate it. And so we look, for example, Dynasty 25. They were ruled by kings from Nubia. They are known as Egypt's Black Kings. And they took the iconography royal ideology straight from the playbook of the Old Kingdom, and they became more Egyptian than the Egyptians themselves, looking back. And if you look at their artwork, it is totally Old Kingdom. So there's always this looking back at history, looking back at great times, and this is one of the greatest for them. So the pyramids clearly articulate this dominance and superiority of the king. They're located on the west bank of the Nile River, and they're built on the highest places on the western horizon, symbolizing the transition between the temporal world, the here and the now, and the divine world. The sun set in the west. Later, the sun became Ra, the sun god, and he was characterized as an old man in the setting sun. He traveled through the darkness of the underworld to be reborn in the morning as a young child, and then traveled during the day on his solar bark, his boat, and then entered into the west. So we have the cycle of death, rebirth, life, death, rebirth, life. So consequently, this focus on the West as the place where you enter into the underworld, this is where we find most cemeteries in Egypt, on the banks of the Nile, on the desert margins. So the story of the pyramids would be pretty short if we were to believe ancient aliens. So, yes. But what we actually see is that the pyramids evolved through a process of experimentation, trial and error, and great cost, almost bankrupting the Egyptian state. Our first great experiment with pyramids begins with the reign of King Joseph. And Joseph has had a fantastic architect named Imhotep. Imhotep devised a step pyramid, and he became worshipped as a deity later on and had his own cult center. And so he was equated with the god Ptah, who was the god of scribes, the god of craftsmen. So he was highly revered during this time period. So what we see is that Joseph had bucked the trend, and he went on to build his tomb in Memphis. And the pyramid complex covers an area of around 37 acres, if that gives you an idea. The pyramid itself is rectangular and was constructed in 6 phases. It took 20 years to build. And Joseph lived for quite a while, so he was lucky. So as a king, you hope to live for a long time, and then you get your complex built. It begins as a mastaba, so a bench-shaped tomb that was common during this time period. And so it's kind of flat top, and then successively we see that levels were added on top. So the 4th stage, we have 3 steps that were added, and on top of the bench, and later it was topped by 2 smaller steps in the 6th phase. All these levels were built of stone, and so this is much more labor intensive than previous burial complexes, which were made of mud brick. That's another reason why when you go back to the pre-dynastic, we don't the availability of tomb finds is scarce, because mud brick does not last quite as long as stone, and erodes much faster. So all in all, the step pyramid is about as large as 1.5 football fields, just to kind of break it down, and around 18 stories or 60 meters tall. The burial chambers are located, as you see, they're underground, and which was common at the time and had been done in previous mastaba tombs. But they go down pretty deep, around 30 meters. So it's 9 stories down. So it's pretty impressive. And it's decorated with carved scenes of Joseph, and many of the chambers are lined with blue faience tile. Faience tile is an Egyptian, is characterized in Egyptian. It's a ceramic, like a glass, representing turquoise, we believe. And it's used extensively throughout Egyptian history. And here his tombs are lined with faience. So indicating a rather large workshop that was engaged in building here and decorating his complex here. Excavation of these underground storerooms have revealed around 40,000 stone vessels containing provisions for him. So quite a lavish display. This guy wanted to be prepared for his afterlife. So the Egyptians really did believe you can take it with you. You were going to live your life as you live your life in death as you did in this world, and thereby you would be alive. You would be revived. We see that the palace facade architecture is also prevalent at this time in his tomb. So it's still, we see the echoes of Mesopotamian influence here. There are actually several step pyramids from the 3rd dynasty of subsequent kings around. Most of them, actually all of them, were never finished. And it has to do probably with the fact that these kings died. When a king died, if their monument was not completed, that was too bad. They were buried as quickly as possible, and in some instances we see that their complexes were hurriedly finished off as was acceptable in mud brick. So they did as much as they can, interred the king, and then that's it.
Are you saying that these were built before the king died?
During the king's lifetime.
Okay, so he would build it to himself, and then whenever he died, that's when they just put him under.
Yes. So
okay,
it would be
after death.
No.
That would make sense to me. But.
As the king, once you ascended the throne, the first order of business was designing your tomb.
I really like that idea.
And we see, and that's also what happens with the elite when they, as soon as they had the finances available to them, they would start building their tomb. And in many instances, as they rose up in the ranks and became more prosperous, they could really go to town on it and get a better decorative program and really they saved up essentially and buying things and decorating for their death. It could be another show of status, because when they were buried, there would be these massive processions, and their burial goods would be on display, and so you'd have this huge procession with all these amazing goods going into the tomb, and so it's this display of wealth and power. So it serves not just to provision the king, but as an open display for that brief period of time on the status of that of that individual. It's very different to how we view our preparations for death, to how we prepare for death today. Try not to think about it. So the history of the Third Dynasty is kind of murky. So we enter into that fuzzy period, and it has been suggested that the kings didn't have as much resources as Joseph, so they couldn't also have completed their monuments. Maybe they also didn't have enough power, and so were prevented from building more more like that too. So there's all these theories that are out there, and so we make assumptions based on the evidence that we see at this time. What we see is when we get into the 4th dynasty, we looking at the beginning of a new ideology that emerged within Egyptian kingship. Previous kings had looked to to Horus, and so we see a lot of king ideology associated with the god Horus. Now we start seeing a shift towards the god Ra. He was the sun god, and the kings becoming associated with this god, ultimately becoming the son of Ra. And this may be why we start seeing this move towards a smooth-sided pyramid. And getting to this point took a lot of work. And it is the experimentation of King Snefer of the 4th dynasty that we have to thank for this. He actually built 5 pyramids. First 2 pyramids, number 1, were step pyramids. And that's kind of not good enough, so he builds another one, and these step pyramids took something like 15 years to build, and then they start working and contemporaneously on other projects, on these other pyramid projects. The 3rd one is what we consider a true pyramid, and it begins at Deshur, and the sides are smoothed, and chambers are envisioned inside the pyramid. So there's a movement to not going underground, but moving into the pyramid itself. This indicates a movement higher up, so the king ascending above ground, so associated with this theology of the rising sun. So this is known. Number 2 is known as the bent pyramid, appropriately. Egyptologists are very creative people. But what we start seeing here is that the architects had designed the pyramid to go up, be smooth-sided. What happens is that the rock upon which the pyramid was based was not solid enough, and we start seeing cracks in the pyramid itself. And then they realize that if you're going high up, there's a lot of stresses on the pyramid. So then, to reduce the stress, they lower the angle of the pyramid. That does not work, and this pyramid was completed, but they did not utilize it as a burial chamber. And then he moves on and he creates this 3rd pyramid, the red pyramid, which is our official real pyramid now. And it's the slope is 45 degrees and constructed in a series of layers. And it's the largest. This is the 3rd largest pyramid. So it's this, what we see is this experimentation that happens. Not just someone had a great idea and they built a pyramid. It's a process of time and evolution. These pyramid builders learnt from their mistakes and applied the concepts that they had learned and that they knew were successful. What we see is also new. So we have the burial chamber within the pyramid. We also have a long causeway, and that links the pyramid to a temple. Previously, in other burials, we had these mastabas or step pyramids, and they were enclosed by walls, and there were temples located nearby. Now we have a temple and a long causeway, and they become orientated east-west. Previously, we have orientations north-south. So there's a different view. East-west, the movement of the sun. So there's a change So it's definitely this imagery, the solar imagery, becoming very important. Okay, so Ben and our red pyramid. So he's a major influence on the rest, on his sons and grandsons. So his son is the famous Khufu. Khufu built the Great Pyramid because he did not want to be outdone by his father. So Khufu's Great Pyramid is built in Giza. The reason for this location is that it's on solid bedrock. And it's probably one of the few areas that can handle the weight of this pyramid. It's just to give you something, it took 23 years to build, and it contains, Zahi Hawass estimates 1.3 million blocks of stone. Average weight about 2.5 tons, but there's heavier stone at the base too. So the base of the pyramid covers 5.2 hectares, and they're aligned with cardinal points. So here we see for the first time this desire to align with the cardinal points. I'm going to move on, and this is the next great pyramid boulder. The second biggest pyramid in Giza is Khufu's second son, Menkure. Menkure didn't want to outdo his father, but what he did, he built a smaller pyramid, but he put it on higher ground, so it kind of looks a little bigger. There's a little optical illusion. He is famous for also utilizing a rock outcropping and carving the Sphinx. So that this becomes the ultimate manifestation of the king's power. This view is the king's face on the lion, the body of a lion. Here's a great aerial view of the pyramids. And during this time period, we also see the movement towards another deity, Osiris, and so the tombs of the next dynasty of kings, of the 5th dynasty, their pyramids become lined with texts called pyramid texts. So they describe the king's journey from the pyramid into the heavens, and so it's an aid, an assistance in rebirth. But we see more mentions of the god Osiris, and so in funerary offerings of private individuals, we have these offering formula that refer to the individual as Osiris. So we're seeing this analogy here, and some people have called it democratization of these royal funerary texts, but I think that's incorrect to look at it like that. They sharing in that afterlife with the king. You don't see this in royal tombs. So the king is not equating himself with these private individuals. So if you look at that handout that I gave you, to impress your friends and family, if you go into a museum, they have these standard offering formula. These are known as the Hetep Denisu formula, and it always begins, an offering which the king gives to Osiris, lord of Jedu, great god of Abydos, so that he may make verbal offerings, prayers in bread, beer, ox, fowl, alabaster, linen, everything good and pure on which a god lives. And so you will see this everywhere that you find tomb architecture in private individuals. And so it's a standard invocation. And so these offerings give these individuals provisions for the afterlife. If their tombs are robbed, something happens to the tomb, they are guaranteed through this inscription to have provisions, and they will be looked after in the afterlife. So, are we done? Okay, cool, thank you. So we will end there. Basically, after the 6th dynasty, Egypt goes down, and there's a civil war. So, thank you.